Okay, welcome to the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing here at the University of Lancaster, and I'm very, very pleased to be welcoming guests and guest speakers. So we are calling this event Reading the Return, and the idea is that our colleague here at Lancaster, Professor Terry Eagleton, last year, I think, or maybe the year before, published in the new Blackfriars an essay called "When Will Christ Come Again?" And so today's plan is that our three distinguished guest speakers are going to be speaking to Terry's essay, and then we'll have a conversation and we'll see how things go. And we have three or possibly two. Our third speaker, Mary McCampbell, is not with us as we speak, so we will play that by ear. We will be hearing then from Dr. Rebekah Lamb from the University of St Andrews, who I'll say a bit more about in a second, and then we'll be hearing certainly from Professor Matthew Potts from Harvard Divinity School. So my task then, just briefly now, then is to I think it's 2 minutes, just to give a kind of brief précis of Terry's essay, if you've not had a chance to read it. It's wonderfully short and wonderfully wonderful. Okay, 3 points, it seems to me, 3 points, one might say. Firstly, that the return of Christ is in part an event within time, so not outside of time. In that sense, it is something to do not only with eternity, but also history. Okay. Second point, we are not wholly in the dark as to when Christ will come again, since we are told he will come like a thief in the night, which is to say, he will come when we are in the dark, or when we know we're in the dark, the greatest dark, which is to say, that point at which our attempt to build the New Jerusalem is most utterly in ruins. That's the point at which Christ will return. Provokes Terry. Thirdly and finally, the return of Christ is not an event for which we simply wait, but rather one that does involve some kind of human agency, in that we are positively called to the impossible task of building the New Jerusalem. Cue every failing act of love, justice, and friendship. Okay, so that's my take on Terry's essay. So with little further ado, I'll introduce Rebekah, who is lecturer in theology, imagination and the arts in the School of Divinity at St Andrews, specialising in religion, literature and the visual arts, and in the long 19th century, and currently involved in co-editing the Cambridge Companion to Gerard Manley Hopkins in Context. And Rebekah is going to be speaking now on returning to the present. Rebekah.
Thank you very much for the invitation and introduction, John. I might just add I'm contributing to that Cambridge Companion, but not co-editing it. But I'm delighted. Hopkins is my favorite poet, and so just even contributing is such a joy for me. Thank you so much, John, as well as Mark, Andrew, and the rest of you who have organized this wonderful event. And I'm sorry that Terry couldn't be with us today, but I look forward to the opportunity to perhaps engage with him at some point about his essay, which was deeply powerful and incisive and provided me with a lot to think about. And certainly what I'll say today probably won't fully be able to capture or do justice to everything he's offered to us for contemplation, but I'll attempt anyway. Speaking of contemplation, I do want to note that this essay that I'm responding to that Terry wrote in the Blackfriars is in the contemplative register. It's certainly drawing together many of his various approaches to questions of the literary, of history, of culture more broadly, and then how Christianity informs them, uniquely, I'd say. But it is also offered in something of a contemplative mode. It's rather porous in terms of it's partly a reflection, drawing on aspects of Christian doctrine and what it can mean for history. And then also it, draws in some of his extensive thinking about society and history. So I've decided to attempt to follow suit. My approach is going to be somewhat in the contemplative register as well, and I hope that will prove useful for our conversation today. Our human condition is, as Eagleton has often reminded us, driven by an unconscious fear of death. Death is the event of radical discontinuity. It is the split, rupture, interruption of the intelligible, and much more besides. As Eagleton reminds us in his essay, When Will Christ Come Again? Death is so powerful and strange a force that even though it directly impacts us, we cannot experience it directly, even strangely when it is about to happen to us. Drawing from Wittgenstein, Eagleton quips that death is a kind of second-hand event. At most, we can only be aware of the moment before our own death. It's worth quoting from a passage of the essay, which you can see up on the screen, and to quote it at some length, as it will nicely set up some of the reflections that I'd like to focus on today. So here's the quotation. We also have Blake's very moving Christ in the Sepulchre as part of the background to this slide, which I thought was fitting. Death isn't an experience in life, but the limit of that experience, Eagleton tells us. One can be present at one's own dying, but not at one's own death. If it happens at a particular moment in time for those gathered around the deathbed, it happens at no identifiable moment for you, since if you could register that moment, you would still be alive. As far as you are concerned, your last moment isn't the moment of your death, but the moment before that. Since most people can't predict at exactly which moment they will die, neither can they recognize the moment before it as their last. I say most people because there are rare cases in which you can know for sure that you will die in 3 seconds from now, in which case you would not know what your last moment will be for others, though not for yourself. We may, if we are lucky, then to return to the key point in this passage, we might know what our last moment will be for others, though not for ourselves. This being for others is an interesting turn of phrase here, and I want to fuss over it and make much of it because I think it's very important. Whether Eagleton was particularly conscious or careful about that phrasing when he decided to use it, though my hunch was he was very conscious and careful when he chose to use that phrase. In understanding that life, and especially in death, our experience is also for others, we have the opportunity to widen our field of vision and think about whether the fact of death and the second coming itself has been too often cast into negative a light. Eagleton himself wishes to propose to us that we can see in the end of the end, that is in Christ's return, a deep and remarkable mercy, a remarkable act of God being for us more than we can be for ourselves. After all, if it is true that Christ will come again, then this means that the defeat of death which he accomplished through his redemptive work will be definitively announced in history, thereby bringing about its end. But this end is the beginning of the eternal present, as it were, of mercy. The transformation, the merciful conclusion of history, is a fascinating concept in Eagleton's essay, and one which proposes that the apocalyptic work of God is redressive, not tyrannical. It is the showering of abundance and the offering of new life in a way which outstrips what most of us could dare hope for, namely a weighing and balancing of the scales of justice only. Instead, Eagleton proposes that in the Christian message and example, found in the Jesus of history, who is also the Christ of God, we see that we ourselves often bring down the threat of a ravaging apocalypse on our own cities, children, and possible future. By contrast, Christ offers a different kind of apocalypse, a calamity of mercy grounded in his being for us and his commandment that we be for each other too. Christ's call and witness to agapic love not only transforms our lives, but our very notion of the end. It's a very ancient, even unconscious way to think of the end as impending doom. However, Jewish and Christian apocalyptic literature suggests otherwise, despite popular interpretations of them to the contrary. In light of Christ, the apocalypse is no longer destruction per se, but transformation first and foremost. Or to put it another way, it is the paradoxically abyssal process of rebirth into new and elevated life, which can't come easily given our condition. Divine mercy is a mercy which, to adapt an apt phrase from T.S. Eliot, requires a condition of complete simplicity, costing nothing less than everything, of paring down to what is simple, what is good, true and lasting. This simplicity involves the continual return to the present moment, which can be a very difficult task. And many spiritual writers throughout the Christian tradition have focused a lot on how we can return to the present, as it seems it's so much easier and more comfortable, especially for our consciences, to escape into an imagined future. Many spiritual writers have even dared to call a return to the present a sacrament, or at least sacramental, meaning that it becomes a special means through which divine grace can operate and transform the world around us, for us and for others, and in cooperation with freedom. Through mercy, both divine and human, personal transformation can ripple outwards, becoming, in the derivative mode, a source of social and political healing, as well as historical redress. This is why Eagleton thinks Christ will only rejoin us when we are in the worst possible shape, when we seem to have exhausted or perhaps given up in our capacity to live up to our status as bearers of the image of God. Will this capacity ever fully dry up and wither on the vine? I'm not sure that's possible. And so I would like to offer a suggested addition to Eagleton's thoughts on his own and our collective question, when will Christ come again? My addition would be to say Christ is already here, operating in what Ratzinger would call the analogical mode, which can be expressed temporally as the already and also as the not yet. Now, Eagleton does gesture to aspects of this, but I think the term analogy would be very helpful for further refining the theological implications of his reflection on the status of the apocalypse within history and Christianity. Christ's incarnation inaugurated a new kind of divine presence in the world, the liturgical presence, the sacramental presence, the communion of saints, which binds persons to each other throughout history and well beyond it. Now, what are we to make of this, those of us who may not stand on firm ground when it comes to belief, let alone any Christian belief or assent? I think this is where Eagleton's wider philosophical project can come to our intervention and aid, at least to help us perhaps sympathetically engage with this essay, which he does write in a rather convicted mode from the standpoint of faith. His claim that literature and the imagination more broadly can serve a redressive and transformative function for us and wider culture is not just a daring recovery of a deep and wide tradition of reading texts. It can also serve as a lifeline for us here within history, and a limited, although powerful echo perhaps of evangelium, of the good news proclaimed. I think there are some very interesting parallels between his approach to apocalypse and also his approach to literary criticism. For instance, in How to Read a Poem, Eagleton observes that one of the special features of the imagination and of art more broadly is to dance or play in the face of death, making our contingencies part of our art, our free creativity, and not necessarily an obstacle to them per se. After all, as contingent beings, all we have are our contingencies. In this way, literature is a kind of supplement, he says, to our unavoidably impoverished lives, a sort of spiritual prosthesis, which extends our capabilities beyond their normal restricted range. For, he concludes, it is true that everyone's experience is bound to be limited, and that art can valuably augment it, even if it cannot overcome the contingencies of being and time. Supplementary, generous, expansive, literature bears some of the distinctive marks of mercy. For Eagleton, in When Will Christ Come Again, Christ is the source and summit of mercy. Mercy is a divine attribute too easily forgotten because we so easily forget to exercise it ourselves. And we are always trying to make God into our image as opposed to living up to our likeness in him. However, Eagleton has hope that in turning to acts of friendship, mercy, and goodness, the works of the New Jerusalem, as it were, we may be able to live an artful life, to recover aspects of our divine likeness, in which the unconscious fear of death, which drives us, is at least supplemented by or tempered by a culture of care. If this happens, he concludes that the apocalypse may not turn out to be a particular conflagration of our current and largely self-made disasters. Eagleton doesn't stop there. He doesn't just hope for a gentler apocalypse. He puts the blame on us if it doesn't transpire that way. God respects human freedom, he reminds us, and so it is both plausible and reasonable to think that the manner of Christ's return will attend to and in some way incorporate the way free human agency has been exercised in history. It is all too easy to think we can outsource virtue sometimes or justify away responsibility, and Eagleton tells us we do this at our peril. We forestall the merciful transformation of the cosmos, he even suggests. Instead of extending the hand of agapic friendship, we push it away. Our acts in the present moment, then, help answer the very question Christ poses in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 18, verse 8. In this passage, he asks, "When the Son of Man returns, will he find faith on earth?" For those of us who are familiar with this passage, he answers his own question by telling the parable of the tax collector and Pharisee, who both enter the temple to pray. Confident of his righteousness, the Pharisee gives God a list of his good deeds. By contrast, the tax collector lingers in the threshold of the temple, striking his breast and asking for mercy. In his turn to the literary, to storytelling, Christ here offers us a narrow yet life-giving way towards the apocalypse of healing, which he intends for the cosmos. This way consists in a contrite searching of the conscience, which, if sincere, can only lead us to seek mercy and extend it to others. This is what Eagleton is getting at, I think, when he concludes his essay with the following points which I'll use to finish my own reflection and perhaps frame broader conversation. If you could switch to the next slide, that would be very helpful. Thank you. And here's a quote towards the end of the essay. And I've paired it with a painting of the contemporary devotional artist Michael O'Brien, which is called Christ and Adam, which I think is a very interesting reflection on mercy in visual form. So here's the quote from Eagleton. God respects our freedom because the source of it himself, he will presumably give us every opportunity to build as much of the New Jerusalem as possible with our own hands. Only when it is clear that this project lies utterly in ruins is he likely to act. And whether we have failed or not is to be judged not simply by the state at which we finally arrive, but also by every historical struggle for justice and friendship, weighed against every squalid betrayal of it. In conclusion, then, in reading the return and considering the end, we realize that both tasks involve each one of us, and not just in the future. Rather, the apocalypse is now. It is in our careful turn and return to the present moment, to our present opportunities, duties, demands, hopes, and fears. For Eagleton, we cannot outsource the apocalypse. Its dramatic denouement is always already heading straight through us. If we stand perhaps with the tax collector or like him, striking our breasts at the threshold of the temple, we will increasingly see that the apocalypse, as Eagleton understands it, is not just going to pierce through us. It will be, and perhaps already is, for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you. We will doing that in our heads. So thank you. So what we will do now then is we'll move across to Matthew, and then we will be discussing, unless of course Mary arrives. Matthew is Plummer Professor of Christian Morals on the Faculty of Divinity at Harvard. He writes and teaches at the intersection between ethics and literary studies, and his next book is Forgiveness, an Alternative Account, coming out with Yale later this year. So Matthew is going to be talking to Vanishing Returns. Matthew.
Thanks, John. I'm going to try to share my presentation now. Just a moment. Can folks see this all right?
Good, yeah, that's brilliant.
Okay, great. Thanks again, John, and thanks to everyone at the University of Lancaster for organizing this and for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm also disappointed that Professor Eagleton couldn't join us, not just because I'm so grateful for this short essay, but also because I'm so grateful for his work over many years. He's meant a lot to me just as a scholar since I was, since I was studying for my master's degree. I discovered him because of a beloved teacher here, so just grateful to be in direct conversation with him, and perhaps more direct conversation in days to come. So thanks to everyone. I also just wanted to say quickly that I'm just recovering from COVID, so I might have a cough, I might have to clear my throat a couple of times. I don't think it'll be too much of a problem, but yeah. So the title of my presentation is Vanishing Returns. I hope the meaning of that title will become clear in the course of the talk. So this is a passage that comes from later in Professor Eagleton's essay, a passage that I found very meaningful and even moving, if I may say. Jesus warns that the end of history is at hand and that we can be redeemed only by justice and friendship. These are, words that echo a lot of what John and Rebekah already said. This may not have sounded at all that convincing to some of those who listened to him. It's a lot more convincing now. Like a good many truths, then this one becomes clearer, retrospectively, as the owl of Minerva takes flight through the darkness. It is our dubious privilege to be able to make sense of eschatology in ways which were not previously possible. The second coming is most intelligible, not as an arbitrary arrest of history, but as an act of mercy in circumstances which cry out for it, as not as the end of history, but as mercy within the scope of history, as Rebekah was just speaking about. I want to think about that last line. I mean, one of the things that's going on in this passage is that the end of history, it sounds like in this passage, was just as unintelligible then as it is now. That unintelligibility remains, but the act of mercy is what Professor Eagleton is calling us to, and that's sort of what I want to dwell upon. But I also want to suggest that how we approach, or what our theology of the second coming is, or how we think about the second coming, actually conditions that act of mercy. What we understand as mercy, where we are merciful, to whom we are merciful, or to which situations we hear the cry for mercy, might depend to some degree upon the way we approach the second coming, how we think about the second coming. And to explore this question, I'm going to look at two things, one at a bit more depth than the other kind of briefly. The first, I'm going to look at a 2017 novel by the American novelist Louise Erdrich called Future Home of the Living God, which is a kind of apocalyptic dystopian novel in the mode of many of those that are being released now. And I'm also going to look at a line, just an idea from the French Jesuit, Michel de Certeau. And actually Certeau's approach to the resurrection, how he speaks about the resurrection. So to Future Home of the Living God first. I'm just going to give a kind of, because I don't have a great deal of time, although maybe we have a bit more time than we had originally planned. But just for the sake of not boring you too much, I won't give too deep a plot summary of this novel, but I'll try to give you as much as is needed for the talk to make sense. So this is a 2017 novel by Louise Erdrich. For those who may not know, Louise Erdrich is a contemporary American novelist. She writes out of, she's an indigenous Ojibwe, she's an indigenous American, and she writes around sort of the intersection between indigenous communities in the upper Midwest of the United States and the kind of colonial American project. And so one of the things that's happening with, I think, this book being set as it is, as an apocalyptic text or a dystopian text, is it's raising the question of apocalypse. I mean, apocalypse is a sort of transitive noun. It takes an object. Apocalypse for whom, right? And I think one of the things this novel suggests, and one of the things that I think even Professor Eagleton suggests in his 2015 book, Hope Without Optimism, is that apocalypse comes for communities. The world has ended before for communities, and especially for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. There has been an experience of apocalypse already, and Erdrich is playing with this history and thinking through this history through a projected sort of dystopian future that she's generating here. So quickly, this is it's an epistolary novel. And for those of you who have read it, I beg some forgiveness for my summarizing it, but it's an epistolary novel. The main character, the person who authors the series of letters, is a woman named Cedar Songmaker, who's an indigenous woman. Interestingly, her name, Cedar Songmaker, is she's adopted by white parents, and her white parents are sort of kind of upper Midwestern hippies, and they name her Cedar Songmaker. And her indigenous parents, who she finds early in the novel, are actually named Eddie and Mary Potts. No relation to me, but they have very English names, which is already, I think, toying with the idea of identity and some of these questions early on. She is pregnant. Cedar is pregnant, and she is beginning the novel writing to her unborn child. She's writing these letters to her unborn child, and what we have is a document of her letters to her unborn child. What is happening in the novel, it's within the context of climate change. We know that it's in some near future where the climate has warmed, because even though this takes place in Minnesota, Cedar has memories of winter when things used to freeze back before, right? So we know that the climate change has advanced to some degree, but it's a recognizable world. It's not dramatically different, other than this kind of suggestion that things are somewhat warmer. But what happens is women who are having babies who are giving birth to children in this novel, they are dying frequently in childbirth. The births are becoming very difficult, and a high mortality rate is associated with them. Their children are often stillborn. And when children survive, which they rarely do, they do not have the capacity for speech. Right. And so what the people in the novel, the characters in the novel, this is the novel talking, or characters in the novel talking, not me necessarily talking. What is feared is going on is a sort of reverse evolution. That's the way it's described, that the human race is somehow, evolution is moving backwards and moving away from some sense of advancement. And this leads to panic. In culture, the U.S. government collapses. It's replaced by a government called the Church of the New Constitution. The Church of the New Constitution requires that women who are pregnant be rounded up and that they give birth in institutions which are like prisons. They're like prison hospitals. At first, they're hospitals, which are run like prisons. And then the Church of the New Constitution starts taking over what used to be prisons. And we have a lot of those here in this country. And they convert these prisons to hospitals. And they begin to, because there are so few live births, and so few live births with children who have the capacity for speech or who seem to have quote unquote normal cognitive development, it becomes required that women of childbearing age report to these institutions and become impregnated so that they can continue the race. Cedar is in hiding because she does not want to do this. Cedar also has, based upon the kind of medical and ultrasound scans that she has, what everyone believes is the quote unquote normal child, a pregnancy that appears normal and a child whose development seems normal. Okay, so that's kind of the plot summary of the novel. So what's going on in this novel? There are questions about progression and regression. Like what does it mean how do we understand advancement for whom, and how do we understand like regression, right? One of the things that happens when the U.S. government collapses is that the U.S. government stops paying attention to reservation governments, to indigenous communities, and those communities get a lot of their land back. And it seems like these indigenous communities are less affected by this new development around childbirth. And so many indigenous communities are growing and starting to thrive in ways they have not in centuries, while a dominant American or U.S. American or U.S. governmental structure collapses and white culture around these communities collapses. And so this raises the question of, okay, who is progressing and who is regressing, and what does that mean? And the second thing has to do, I think that Erdrich is suggesting this, the idea that humans are either coming to an end as a race, or that something's changing with human childbirth or human procreation or human regeneration, is not necessarily bad news for the larger ecological community, right? Beyond the human race. So again, the question that the novel asks is, advancement for whom, progression for whom, regression for whom. The dystopian theocracy that we see in this novel is fairly recognizable. I think this idea of a theocratic and tyrannical government taking over North American culture in particular is recognizable. both in a lot of versions of apocalyptic literature, and also in maybe like some of the corners of, well, not really the corners, in some of the some pockets of, not even pockets of American politics right now. So that is recognizable. One thing that's really interesting about this is Erdrich, I think, flipping things around again, is that Cedar is a devout Roman Catholic. The central character of this novel is a deeply, deeply faithful Roman Catholic woman, and as is the indigenous community out of which she comes. There's an indigenous American saint named Kiteri Tekakwitha who makes an appearance at the reservation community. They built a shrine to her. When all this bad stuff happens, white people from Minnesota start coming to the reservation to pray to the shrine of Kiteri Tekakwitha on the reservation. And so there is this complicated thing about religion going on, where we have a dystopian theocracy, which has arisen as a replacement for the United States government. But there is also this indigenous resistance religion that is deeply rooted with Roman Catholicism, and that Cedar is also a part of. So religion is really complicated in this novel as well. And then this is all towards the question of how bodies are read. What does a body mean? Like, and who has the power to read that body? And this comes from, something I suggested. I mean, it begins early in the novel with something I suggested early on, which is just the idea of what makes this central character, Cedar, what signs her as either white or indigenous. She has an indigenous sounding name, but that name was given to her by white parents. Her indigenous parents have English names, right? The religious identity, her white parents are not religious, they're very secular, and her indigenous parents are part of a European Catholic heritage. And all these questions are going on. And it also has to do with sort of, what do these children who are born mean? How do we read those bodies? Or do we read them as progression or regression, as evolution, or as devolution? What do these bodies mean? So this is part of what the novel is raising from the outset. In one of her letters to her unborn child, Cedar quotes Thomas Merton at length. She edits a Catholic magazine, right? And so she's always writing about sort of Catholic thinkers, and her final edition of her magazine before the novel ends is actually on the topic of the incarnation, which again is raising these questions of how we read bodies. What do bodies mean? But this is the passage she takes from and that she quotes from Thomas Merton. Into this world, this demented inn, in which there is absolutely no room for him, that is, for Christ at all, Christ has come uninvited. But because he cannot be at home in it, because he is out of place in it, and yet he must be in it, his place is with those who do not belong, who are rejected by power because they are regarded as weak, those who are discredited, who are denied the status of persons tortured, exterminated. With those for whom there is no room, Christ is present in this world. He is mysteriously present in those for whom there seems to be nothing but the world at its worst. These are lovely lines from Merton. They're theologically, recognizable lines for me. This is kind of a straightforward incarnational theology. It maybe has some liberationist kind of turns from when Merton was writing. But this is New Testament stuff too, that Christ is in the least among us, and so forth. Those in need of mercy, to invoke Professor Eagleton's language again, are the ones who manifest Christ's return. Those who are most in need of mercy are the ones where Christ is, and those are the ones to whom we should extend those acts of mercy, right? And again, so it's a question of how to read bodies. And if we look at this novel and who are the folks who are bearing the world at its worst, we can see it's the women who are being imprisoned, and also the children who are being kind of taken away from the children who survived childbirth, who are being taken away and cordoned off and so forth. But I think the novel also complicates this picture. So this is a scene late in the novel. The father of the child is a man named Phil. So the father of Cedar's child is a man named Phil, who spends the first half of the novel hiding other pregnant women so they can give birth away from these institutions. He's eventually caught and tortured extensively, and he disappears for a while, having been tortured. And then he eventually finds Cedar again, and he tries to convince Cedar to run away with him. And this is the passage. Phil's voice is wistful, childish, and I can't even look at his damaged hands. It's in Cedar's voice. The thing is, Phil says very softly. You have a treasure, Cedar, if our baby is normal. We would be in charge of things. Rich, super rich. We'd be safe. If we somehow worked out genetically, I mean, to have a normal child, the sky's the limit for us. We could seize power and found a dynasty, I say, meaning it sarcastically. That's right, says Phil softly, reaching for me. So Cedar's making a joke, right? She's seeing Phil regard their child, her child, this child, as a token of power, as a way to secure their future. He's just survived torture. He's been, I mean, the novel presents him sympathetically in general because he's been so badly damaged. But in this moment, perhaps as a result of his damage, what he wants is safety in his future. He sees this child as a way to gain some safety, and he's asking her, can we build power around this child? Can we build a dynasty around this child? This child has assumed sort of a messianic, in one sense, a messianic, not in every sense, but in one sense, a messianic kind of character. And this is what he wants to do with the child, unironically. Although Cedar has a different idea, and then she says no, obviously, after this, and Phil disappears from the novel after this. But what Phil is suggesting is actually exactly what the dystopian state, the Church of the New Constitution, is also suggesting. Cedar is captured at the end of the novel. She's put into one of these prison hospitals or hospital prisons. And all these women are there under the pretense that they have violated the law, that they not consent to being there in the first place. And so this is the rhetoric that comes from the governmental figure called Mother, who speaks to the women. You are here because you did something wrong, she says, but this is a place of forgiveness. Open your heart, your mind, your body, and your soul. Accept life. You can be absolved of anything you did. You can completely win back God's love by contributing to the future of humanity, by securing a future. By giving us our future, you will pay for your wrong. Your happy sentence is only 9 months. So I think what I want to, yeah. Did you want to say something, John?
No, sorry, you seemed to freeze for a split second. Sorry.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. So I think what I want to think about is and use Michel de Certeau to think about is how these figures, how this sort of move towards securing the future, think about how that becomes an abusive move, a tyrannical move, right? We see the glimmers of it in Phil when he, having been abused and having been tortured, he comes to Cedar and says, this child can be our token to safety, and we should take it. We should make ourselves safe and build a dynasty, build a power around this one token of safety. But this is the same thing that the Church of the New Constitution is doing, which is saying we have lost our future because all these children are dying. All the women who are giving birth to these children are dying. The children who survive are not ones who seem that they can perpetuate the future that we imagine for ourselves. And so all we can do is figure out a way to find the child who will give us the future that we hope for ourselves, that we imagine for ourselves. And it leads to a whole number of abuses. People sacrifice to the idea of that future, to the imagination of that power, to the imagination of that security. These just all women of childbearing age in the Americas become sacrificed to that future under the language, as this slide shows, of a kind of forgiveness or redemption. So this is Michel de Certeau. So I've got a couple of quotes here, just very short ones from two of his works. I think Mary just showed up, so yeah, sorry. So Michel de Certeau was a late 20th century, mid to late 20th century Jesuit sociologist, historian, sometime theologian, and he has this interesting reflection upon the resurrection that shows up in a couple of places. It shows up mostly in the Mystic Fable. I think I'm reading something of it into this other essay, How is Christianity Thinkable Today? Certeau notes that notes the distress of Mary at the tomb when she finds the tomb empty, and her pleading to the man there, tell me where you have laid him. What Certeau describes it is the haunting question of an impossible morning, where art thou? And this where art thou, this kind of searching question, becomes what he calls the mystic question, that the mystic is always searching for the space where Christ was for Christ, and that this desire to find Christ, to see Christ, is essential to the mystic quest, to the mystic experience. But what's also at stake in that is what Certeau says is in this other essay, How is Christianity Thinkable Today? Which is that Jesus' disappearance becomes a sign of a different future. What Certeau argues is that the disappearance of Jesus creates the possibility for the arising of a different form for Christ, for the church to arise, for discipleship to arise. Were Christ simply present in a simple and direct way, then we would have Christ. It's because Christ is absent, because the tomb is empty, that we are caused to ask the question again and again, where are you? Where is Christ? Where are you? And to keep looking and trying to find Christ. What the resurrected Christ resists is being captured or apprehended or understood. The John 20:17 passage, which in Latin is noli me tangere, in Greek me mu aptu, actually has a sense of, do not cling to me, do not hold on to me. I'm moving on. And so what Certeau recognizes or diagnoses is this sort of longing movement within Christianity for a Christ who is, as soon as he is found, is not there. And he says this is necessary to the movement of the church, necessary to the growth of the church, necessary to the acts of the church, the acts of mercy that the church undertakes, that as soon as Christ is recognized, that Christ disappear. And the reason, I think, is because of the dangers that attend to believing that we have captured or apprehended Christ, which is what literature, I think, and this novel in particular, does a great job of describing. That when we believe we have captured the Christ, when we have gotten God under our control or contained God within our institution, then our reaction is to stop looking and to build a fortress around it, or build a cathedral around it, or build a future around it, which in stopping that search, it excludes a whole body of people from outside the bounds of our fortress or our cathedral or our future, and makes all those people outside our fortress or cathedral or future expendable or sacrificable to the image of God that we think we have found. This is also something that, it's not just in literary fiction. I see it in literary fiction, not just in Erdrich, but also in other contemporary American writers, especially ones who are engaged with Roman Catholicism, I think in some indirect ways, like Toni Morrison and Cormac McCarthy. But it also shows up in works of theology and historical theology. There's a book by the scholar Lauren Winner called The Dangers of Christian Practice, which came out a few years ago, which looks at how European sacramental devotional practices of Eucharistic adoration tend to be located at places of anti-Semitic violence, right? And that the idea that we have found Christ, that we have held Christ, is linked to this idea that we have stopped looking for Christ and exclude others from our vision of Christ. So one thing I think I would like to do, or like to think through with Louise Erdrich and Certeau in the wake of Terry Eagleton's article, is to think through how Certeau's reading of resurrection could be applied to the second coming. Because what we see with the resurrection appearances throughout the New Testament, is as soon as Christ appears, Christ disappears, Christ vanishes. So we have the story of Emmaus, right? Where Christ is gone, Christ has died, the disciples are leaving Jerusalem, and they do not know where Christ is, and they don't know what's going on, and a stranger comes who they do not recognize as Christ, and they speak to him and they welcome him with hospitality, and then they recognize that he is Jesus, and as soon as they recognize that he is Jesus, he vanishes. And so they have to go look again. And we see this also in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John does not say that Christ disappears, but the fact that he appears multiple times means that he must have disappeared in the interim, right? And so Jesus appears time over and over again. What happens is, in the gospel appearances of Jesus, it's the traveler or the gardener or the stranger who is not recognized as Christ and then becomes recognized as Christ. And as soon as he is recognized as Christ, he disappears, which allows for the possibility that the next stranger or the next traveler or the next gardener will be recognizable as Christ again. It is that vanishing movement, that vanishing return, which kind of conditions the sight of the disciples for them to see Christ in someone new and not stop looking. It allows them to keep asking the question, where art thou? Rather than decide, you are here, you are with us, and to build a fortress or a cathedral or a future around that monument. So that's why I'm calling these disappearances iterable, repeatable. They're necessarily repeatable. They must happen again. And as soon as that return happens, it has to disappear in order for the movement of mercy to continue. What happens then, I think what I'd like to suggest is a form of second coming, an idea or a theology of the second coming, which follows this model, Certeau's model of resurrection appearances, would open rather than secure a future. rather than saying we have found the Christ, let's build a future around him, as the Church of the New Constitution would want to do, or as Phil wants to do with Cedar. It looks to a future which is undetermined, which is maybe imagined, but which we are invited to imagine again or imagine anew. And it also depends upon sort of a Christian posture towards the presence of Christ, where we believe the promise enough that we never stop looking for Christ. When we hear what Merton says, that Christ is in the least among us, we believe that promise enough that we never stop looking for Christ. But we also never believe that promise is fully made good, because that would lead us to stop looking. And to stop looking would be to collapse in upon ourselves and to turn inward into the sort of dystopia and violence that Erdrich warns us about. So I did go a bit long. I'm sorry, but that's my reading of Eagleton's essay and what it inspired me when thinking about both the resurrection and Louise Erdrich's recent novel.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you. A second wonderful and wonderfully different engagement. Thank you. So I am very pleased to say that Mary is with us. It's probably a mistaking of time and blah, blah, blah. Mary, hello.
Hello.
Okay, Mary.
I'm here. Yes, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm so sorry. I am horribly embarrassed. I got the time zone. I thought I was early and I was proud until I saw Andy sending me messages on Facebook. So here I am, and I'm sorry that I missed the other wonderful papers, but I'm here.
So easily done. So you're okay to go. If I introduce you, you'll be okay to go.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Okay. So my pleasure then to introduce our final speaker, who is Mary McCampbell, Associate Professor of Humanities at Lee University, works on post-secularism in a number of fields, contemporary literature and culture, particularly in empathy, narrative art, and prophetic tradition in African American literature. And her first book comes out later this year, Imagining Our Neighbours as Ourselves, How Art Shapes Empathy. So my pleasure to hand over to Mary, who's going to speak to An Embodied Return, the Expectation of the Disinherited. Mary.
Thank you. I'm wanting to share.
Okay, yeah, that's working pretty well, perfectly. Yeah,
it's there. Oh, good, wonderful.
If you want to go from the start, then you'll get the brilliant. Thank you.
Okay. My opening photo is a very recent one. You probably recognize it. It's from Saturday, May 14th, 2022, when a young white supremacist killed 10 Black residents in Buffalo, New York, when they were on their weekly grocery trip. We know that the young man who used a rifle had used a rifle with a racial slur painted on it, and he followed the instructions of his own 180-page manifesto. A few days ago, I watched a community meeting and vigil organized by the Buffalo, New York NAACP. I was struck by the deeply religious nature of the meeting, because the NAACP is not inherently a religious organization. There were gospel songs. There were local preachers praising God in the midst of this unthinkable tragedy. There were grief-stricken residents clinging to one another, crying out for Jesus to come and heal their hearts, their community, their land. In his very well-known short study, Jesus and the Disinherited, Howard Thurman both asks and answers the question, what do the teachings of Jesus have to say to those who stand at a moment in human history with their backs against the wall, the poor, the disinherited, the dispossessed? And in watching the NAACP meeting after this mass slaughter of Black lives, which is historically, of course, not an isolated incident, but a pattern bolstered by white supremacist rhetoric, I felt a sense of urgency for change, for healing, for redemption, for soul and body and societal transformation. The belief in the return of the embodied Christ to both judge and recreate the world is also the belief of a rupture within time, a moment when all that has falsely been normalized is subverted, the veil is lifted, the real is undisputed. In this paper, I want to argue that those from marginalized communities will perhaps experience less of a rupture upon the return because of a posture of longing and expectation. Although this is somewhat of a generalization, I want to make it more specific by talking about the African American church tradition in the United States. This posture of longing and expectation does not lead to a passive waiting for the embodied return of Christ, although this is their greatest hope, but an urgent sense of confronting and subverting earthly injustice to work towards societal flourishing and transformation. And When Will Christ Come Again? Terry Eagleton at one point talks about the human capacity to extinguish both ourselves and our planet. He says, for the first time then, it is possible for us to know on our pulses rather than abstractly acknowledge the dominant tone of the gospel, which is one of urgency. Jesus warns that the end of history is at hand and that we can be redeemed only by justice and friendship. This may not have sounded all that convincing to some of those who listen to him. It's a lot more convincing now. It is true that the Enlightenment promise of progress has led to a greater capacity for self-destruction via destroying the environment and blowing each other up. And this does create a sense of urgency, but I want to say that this sense of urgency is nothing new for the disinherited. It is correct that collectively, those who've historically maintained the comfortable status quo through their sometimes denied and unrecognized power have probably not felt this sense of urgency. This is true for many of us, of those who are religious and powerful and who have used their religion often as a means to gain more power. This makes a great deal of sense when Eagleton reminds us of 1 Thessalonians 5:2, when Paul tells his readers that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. And then just 2 verses later, he also says, but you are not in darkness, brothers, for that day to surprise you like a thief. And Eagleton picks up on the mention of darkness here, and I'll read the quote. In fact, the gospel tells us when the kingdom will arrive, namely as a thief in the night. This isn't, of course, to be taken literally, but neither should it be seen as purely metaphorical, or rather, we should exchange one metaphor for another and equate night with dark, gloom, confusion, and so on. Christ, that is to say, won't arrive in the clear light of humanity's most impressive attempts at building the New Jerusalem. On the contrary, he is only likely to rejoin us when we are in the worst possible shape. And once again, even the idea of being in the worst possible shape, this is something that is on some level subjective, but that those in power might not have had the experience of as they're trying to sort of build a more utopian New Jerusalem with their own hands, as opposed to those who are suffering. Those are the ones who are oppressed by the particular understanding of a New Jerusalem. I just took a screenshot when I went back and looked at the end of The Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's famous, propaganda film in which the Ku Klux Klan are the heroes to save white Americans from the evil of blackness. And at the end of the film, if you remember, we see a vision of New Jerusalem and we see white Jesus rising up. So this picture of the end of the return of Christ is a Christ who is returning to reinstate white power, that those who have become anxious because they feel it's being snatched away from them after the freeing of the slaves. But going back to the Eagleton quote, this makes me think of humanity's impressive attempts at building the New Jerusalem. When there's an attempt to build the New Jerusalem for the sake of securing one group's particular power, this is the opposite of the New Jerusalem, obviously. And those who understand the longing for a true New Jerusalem are those that have been impressed by that building of power. We also, I think, see in this, to go back to Eagleton's focus on the darkness, when this says, of course, there is an element of surprise here. This is going to be a surprise. But it sounds like in verse 4 from 1 Thessalonians 5 that if you have not bought into the lies of the darkness, then you won't be as surprised. And so when I'm thinking of this kind of white supremacist system where darkness has been called light, and then those who are on the margins, who are disenfranchised, and who, in some sense, have a prophetic edge because they have never been seduced fully by these claims of power. And so here we see, here we see, I didn't know if that was me echoing or someone else. Here we see the idea of seeing the darkness and acknowledging the darkness and not acclimating to it, but resisting it. And the idea that those on the margins have more of a position from which to resist it. I want to go back to Howard Thurman in relating to this. Well, one more thing I forgot to mention, I'll go back, about this quote that also mentions, of course, the day of the Lord and how the day of the Lord in Jewish tradition would be thought of both as a day for, the fulfillment of all things, the recreation of the earth, but also crying out for punishment and justice to be done. And again, when you're speaking of an oppressed people where things have been so unjust for so long, and that desire to cry out for justice and thirst for righteousness, because there's no sort of anesthetic to make it feel as if it's not there and things are okay. So, okay, so this goes to, well, Howard Thurman. Before I get to Thurman, I just want to mention in this sense of a kind of white supremacist or white Christian nationalist understanding of New Jerusalem, which has to do with a prosperity built on power and oppression. And we see this very clearly in the African, spoken of very prophetically in the African American tradition, with the appendix to the narrative life of Frederick Douglass, where he makes the famous distinction between the hypocritical Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ. And the deep irony of Christianity being used as a weapon is highlighted back in Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. A religion that was born of a people acquainted with persecution and suffering has become the cornerstone of a civilization and of nations whose very position in modern life has too often been secured by a ruthless use of power applied to weakness and defenseless people. And he goes on to talk about how all imperialism functions this way. In the attempt to subject, of course, all empires are built on the backs of slaves. All empires are built on the back of the oppressed. But those building the empire are unable to have a prophetic voice because they've been so seduced by the lure of power and this kind of false utopia. And a prophetic voice is meant to, as David Dark says, crack the pavement of the status quo. As Walter Brueggemann notes, one of the most powerful prophetic tools is lament. Rather than allowing oneself to normalize the darkness, one constantly cries out against it. False peace is not accepted in this sense. And we think about this, I think, with the Black Lives Matter cry, no justice, no peace. And which makes me think very much of Jeremiah 6:14-15. They dress the wound of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace. Are they ashamed of their detestable conduct? No, they have no shame at all. And I've just thought about this so much in the past few days, just reading comments in response to the shooting in Buffalo, and how many still, those who I would say are kind of in a more white nationalist camp, want to kind of pull attention away from the the existence of white supremacy as a systemic problem, and again want to label this as an isolated incident, or this is just one unhinged person, or what about black on black violence? And so there's an attempt to try to bring peace when there is really no peace, when there is a group of oppressed people who, again, are crying out, are longing, and their longings are not being acknowledged. Their lament is seen as something dangerous. So back to the Eagleton essay. Clearly, I'm just kind of riffing off of some of the main ideas in it that it brought up. I kept thinking of the Black Lives Matter movement and the history of racial oppression in my country when reading this, and how so much of it relates. When Eagleton says, the second coming is most intelligible, not as an arbitrary arrest of history, but as an act of mercy in circumstances which cry out for it. And of course, in order to cry out for mercy, you have to have eyes to see injustice. And so part of this entire problem here is the inability to have the eyes to see the injustice. And I think the word here is, the key phrase here is the crying out. That is the key, the crying out. But before crying out, again, you have to acknowledge it. And in the African American spiritual tradition, and of course, it is diverse, it is not monolithic, but I'm thinking of a more kind of traditional Black church theology, and I also pull a bit from liberation theology. But I want to say that two things that I see both in the more traditional kind of Orthodox Black church theology and also liberation theology, and both of these going all the way back to the theology of the African American spirituals, is two different things that are really focused on God as a liberator who sides with oppressed people, and a sense of collective and individual identity because of an associated with an embodied crucified Christ. First of all, God as a liberator. In Esau McCaulley's book, Reading While Black, he mentions, this is very interesting, that while most white evangelical churches, again, he's looking in the United States context, begin with the Pauline epistles, and it's kind of like the starting point in theology and in church services. The starting point for the Black American church tradition is the Exodus. And McCauley says, both the enslaved and their Christian descendants viewed events like God's redemption of history from slavery as paradigmatic for their understanding of God's character. Because of this, they viewed God fundamentally as a liberator. And of course, we can see this very clearly in the spirituals. Go Down Moses, one of the most famous, I just put a quote from here. And James Cone says in his book on spirituals and the blues, this is not a spiritual freedom, is an eschatological freedom grounded in the events of the historical present, affirming that even now God's future is inconsistent with the realities of slavery. And so, I mean, Douglas talks about the spirituals, as much as they are they're laments, they are actually songs of resistance. That lament is something revolutionary and subversive in that context. The second point I'm going to talk about within that is the embracing of a valued identity because of an identification with the crucified Christ. And Josephine Evans talks about a Du Boisian we know Du Bois's double conscious, W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness, but Evans talks about a Du Boisian hermeneutic as a way of interpreting biblical texts, and how, from a Black American perspective, when looking at a biblical text, having to first realize that you've been taught to read this text through the white gaze. And he says Double consciousness empowers the Du Boisian interpreter to read a text in such a way as to make it an instrument of liberation rather than a rationale for oppression, an instrument for the humanization of all peoples. Because of course we know how much the Bible was used as a weapon to try to justify slavery. And so this is a kind of unlearning and going back into the theology of the enslaved to see those reading it, to see themselves in the stories. And so I'll just quickly give a few examples from African American art. This is Christ Re-Crucified by Conti Cullen, one of the Harlem Renaissance artists. And in all three of these that I'm going to show you, we see a shared humanity with Christ and a shared oppression, and the shared embodiment. And here the South is crucifying Christ again. And in the last line, Christ's awful wrong is that he's dark of hue. And so as we hear from someone like James Cone, but also Conti Cullen here, that Christ is black, meaning that he is one of the disinherited. This is Gwendolyn Brooks, The Chicago Defender Sends a Man to Little Rock, just a little excerpt from it. This is a poem about the Little Rock Nine. This when 9 Black students were going in to be integrated into a Little Rock school, and the horrific, venomous, racist treatment they dealt with. You can see this very famous photo, this evil facial expression. But the reporter from the Chicago Defender, which is a Chicago Black newspaper, is sent down, and he's really confused. The first part of the poem is how normal everyone looks, how no one seems to be a monster. And he watches all these white people and he's so confused because the darkness has been so normalized that no one is reacting. I mean, they're just enjoying life. And he's very, very confused by that. But then he ends with these explosive words. I saw a bleeding brownish boy, the lariat lynch wish I deplored. The loveliest lynchy was our Lord. So again, that identification with the embodied and crucified Christ, the one who does not deserve this treatment. The last one I'll give is a very contemporary Nigerian American musician, Toby Nwigwe. And the song is called Just Passing Through, and it's based off a gospel song. The world is not my home, I'm just passing through. And so again, that longing, maybe not so much to leave this physical earth, but to leave a system that has always had you at the bottom. And in here, he is responding to police shootings of unarmed Black men. This for those shot dead in the land of the living. I pray the hood in the sky got streets with gold trimming, and the linens on your back cover sins that's forgiven. And you see he who has risen has the skin that is forbidden. Because oh, how life seems black and white until the light adds color. To those that died, may your soul take pride in knowing you were so much more than colored. These are screenshots from the video, which is incredibly beautiful. So if anyone's curious, I recommend watching it. And the cross and the lynching tree, just to go back to all these images of an association with the crucified Christ and the African-American experience, Cone says, Christ crucified manifested God's love and liberating presence in the contradictions of Black life, the transcendent presence in the lives of Black Christians that empowered them to believe that ultimately, in God's eschatological future, they would not be defeated by the troubles of this world, no matter how great and painful their suffering. So this is a way to hold this tension, to believe in the reality of a good God that cares for the oppressed, but also to live and have to deal within these troubles of the world. But no, that's not the end of the story. So just holding on to the phrase, the troubles of this world, I'm looking at a quote from Eagleton's Culture and the Death of God. He seems to be saying that anyone who truly practices the Christianity of Christ will have a lifetime of troubles. that it's a false understanding to think that Christianity brings about a kind of social cohesion. I'll just read some of this. The idea of religion as a source of social cohesion receives scant support from the Christian gospel. By and large, the teaching of Jesus is presented by that document as disruptive rather than conciliatory. Ethnic, social, and domestic bonds take second place to the demands of justice. It is a question of being homeless, propertyless, peripatetic, celibate, socially marginal, disdainful of kinfolk, averse to material possessions, a friend of outcasts and pariahs, a thorn in the side of the establishment, and a scourge of the rich and powerful. So I just wanted to connect this with the idea of the kind of lifetime of trouble for what African Americans call the struggle, this lifetime of being disinherited, and how Eagleton is saying, well, this is actually what a life truly lived by the gospel will look like. Although, and again, not to say that the African American experience isn't particularly worse, but even those who are going to follow the words of Christ to resist the power structures will also face oppression and difficulties. The last thing I want to just quickly look at, because I know I've already gone over my time, is just from, this is from a popular organization, not academic, but I thought it'd be helpful to bring in this voice, called a group called The Witness, a Black Christian Collective. And this article from Ekemini Uwan, Black theologian, Why We Can't Wait, Eschatology in the Black Lives Matter Movement. Nevertheless, we press on and advocate for the marginalized with sober expectation, but expectation nonetheless. Figuratively, the gospel has hands and feet, and it embraces the hopeless, afflicted, and marginalized. Yet it also convicts oppressors and reveals their brokenness and need for Christ, who is the hope of glory for the oppressed and the oppressor. And so this picture, this eschatological understanding, to me reminds me a lot of what Eagleton is speaking about in the essay, the central essay that we are discussing. And in the African American tradition, there's also very much focus on the great cloud of witnesses, those who came before, the ancestors. And we see this even in the name of this organization. From Eagleton, yet since God respects our freedom, being the source of it himself, he will presumably give us every opportunity to build as much of the New Jerusalem as possible with our own hands. And I think this way of building the New Jerusalem, Jerusalem out of a longing for justice and righteousness is very different than building it a false New Jerusalem for the sake of power. And my last quote will be from MLK. Who really shows us an embodied eschatology, both in the present and the future. Really the idea of earth as it is in heaven, the kingdom of God in the here and now working towards the end. King says it's all right to talk about long white robes over yonder and all of its symbolism, but ultimately people want some suits and dresses and shoes to wear down here. It's all right to talk about streets flowing with milk and honey, but God has commanded us to be concerned about the slums down here and his children who can't eat 3 square meals a day. It's all right to talk about the New Jerusalem, but one day God's preacher must talk about the new New York, the new Atlanta, the new Philadelphia, the new Los Angeles, the new Memphis, Tennessee. This is what we have to do. And by the way, that's from the speech that he gave the night before he was killed in Memphis. So I just want to say that for those crying out for change, the second coming of Christ will perhaps feel more like a glorious continuation of the project they've been working on, the hopes that have bolstered them, and the embodied work of building the kingdom of heaven on earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mary. A third and final wonderful paper. So thank you, and thank you. As you'll have guessed from the number of people arriving in since 3 o'clock, within Eventbrite, there's this weird glitch that communicates sometimes one of its pages an hour wrong, and there's no way of overriding it. I've tried time and again. I think that's a factor. Anyway, if you've arrived late, we are recording and have recorded, we will the video will be up on YouTube, Lancaster Words YouTube channel, within a week or two. However, so what I'm suggesting is if it's okay with our 3 speakers, that we go through to 3:45 to 45-minute mark. Is that okay? Okay, so that please relax and let us converse. So I could ask, but I will hold back. So for anybody who's been here for 20 minutes or for an hour and 20 minutes will want to start the chatting. So either by entering the chat bar or alternatively by raising your hand and then turning your mic and or your camera on. Andy.
Hello. Hi to the 3 of you, and thanks for 3 wonderful papers. Matthew, I have a question for you, but I think it has implications for our other 2 wonderful speakers. Three just great, such different takes responding to Eagleton. Matthew, do you think that the future-oriented fiction that we get with dystopia is particularly kind of hospitable to thinking about those themes of forgiveness, the eschatological in the sense of redemption? Ultimately, is that something you think that is distinctive to that kind of family of genres of which you were working with one key example?
Thanks, Andrew. That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think because Mary's paper is not in my mind now, I think I'd say no. I guess, because I think that a lot of this, I think on the one hand, I want to say this is one of the things I think Erdrich is doing with her novel, is that she's raising up this kind of trope of a particular kind of North American dystopia, but by locating it within an Indigenous American community or the intersection, right? She's trying to say, well, this actually, the end of history already happened to some folks, right? And that's also what Mary's paper is writing. So I mean, Mary's paper suggested, I think, and so I think that there is a way in which dystopian, kind of future-oriented, dystopian or apocalyptic literature does just kind of on its face raise a question of, look at what we've lost, how can it be regained? Look what we might lose to the reader. How do we redeem what we're losing or what we lost? But I think if you look at, Toni Morrison, or who I've also written about like that, those questions are also absolutely on the table, even though the setting is 1860s Cincinnati, Ohio, right? And so I think there is a way in which that genre puts the question on its face for a particular reader. But I think that for other readers of other fictions, that question is also already on the face in important ways.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks so much.
Mary or Rebekah, do either of you want to respond at all? If not, just your mic's off, Mary. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi. Yeah. Do speak if you.
Okay, no.
If you would like
No. I just was going to ask him if he could repeat it again, the question again.
Oh, I see, Andy.
Yeah. No, just brief. I mean, it kind of connects to all of your papers. I was thinking about the genre that Matthew was working within and thinking about dystopian fiction, future-oriented fiction, whether it's particularly hospitable to thinking about eschatological things, particularly where it comes to redemption, forgiveness, and so on. But it might apply to the different strands that you're both thinking about. I mean, Mary, you're particularly thinking about African American writing, protest, and music. And Rebekah, I know that your focus is much more on the 19th century. You had a lovely Blake image in the background of the angels attending the tomb. So I don't know if the genres that you're working in, you might feel that they connect with those, with that kind of eschatological theme.
Well, if I may add, I think that's a really rich question. If I think about some of the early dystopic texts like H.G. Wells, for example, and so on, and then move into the 20th century. I know these are very different kinds of dystopic texts from the kind that Matthew and indeed also Mary in a different way are looking at. But they do think about the potential ultimate conclusions of certain ideologies, of certain philosophical approaches to especially defining the human person. I think around a lot of dystopic narratives is the fundamental question, what does it mean to be human? And very often you see that there's some kind of hierarchical arrangement of people based on, say, a certain kind of ability or adaptability according to a certain desire for power, or say that empire building. I think especially of, something like Brave New World and so on. So I think insofar as these writers are trying to see deeply into their own times, they could certainly be a kind of the prophetic. I think it is also very hard to be prophetic in one's own time. I just finished an essay on John Henry Newman's concept of history, and he talks a lot about how there's the occasional saint or often prophet in the wilderness, or the person who has suffered something profound, who can see an aspect of our times with a kind of a gift of clarity. But very often we have to wrestle a bit more, because the discourse, the prevailing discourse of critique, as important as it is, can sometimes also overlook other important things that we won't see for some time. So it becomes very difficult to judge our moment fully, especially in light of something like eternity, which the apocalypse asks us to do. Nonetheless, there is also, I think it was clear from the other talks, a moral imperative to try to do that as well. And so one of the things that I particularly found fruitful in Eagleton's essay was the degree to which, I think, he doesn't quite expressly say it like this, but I think it's implied, building the New Jerusalem is really an examination of conscience. And it's about learning how to read properly, and also to dare to try to read your own inner workings, which of course can be difficult. I'm just thinking of Psalm 19, forgive my hidden faults or whatever, right? Like there's so much even about ourselves we can't fully see. But I think the dystopic tries to see certain things and foreground certain concerns, perhaps at the expense of others, but that will be inevitable when we narrate. That was a bit rambly, but I think really rich question, and it's making me think about a lot of things, especially after the other two papers.
That's a great answer, Rebekah. Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, you can hear me now, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Sorry. I'm just thinking about, I didn't talk about dystopian fiction, but I feel like I was talking about the perspective of a people who felt like they didn't need a fantasy of a dystopia because they were, actively living it. So I think it can still speak to that question of redemption and forgiveness. And it makes me really think about how there is this line through all the back to, again, Frederick Douglass, then MLK, and even James Baldwin, talking about, of course, they're talking about systemic injustices, but there's a line from Douglass where he says, he's talking about one of his master's wives who wanted to teach him to read, but then was reprimanded. And then she was completely indoctrinated with the ideology of this institution of slavery. And he said that the institution of slavery was just as injurious for her as it was for me. So, which is really interesting. So I see in the African-American tradition, such a care for the soul of the oppressor. And even in the spirituals, it isn't, we hate them, let's kill them, we want them to go to hell. It's, we want to be released. I mean, again, this isn't there are many different views on this, but I'm thinking about the kind of main, what we see, and at least those three thinkers from, two Christians, Douglass, MLK, and then even Baldwin, the idea that we can't be free until we're all free, and that there might be a bodily enslavement, but there's the enslavement of the mind of the white supremacist. So there is a real sense that the only way that we can even try to bring the kingdom of heaven on earth is to all be free, and there's a real concern. And I heard Esau Macaulay say, which was really poignant, I heard him say that Black American Christians, like the enslaved, saved Christian anthropology for America. Like the idea that all human beings are created in the image of God, and it's not based on, skin color or ability. And he was basically saying that we have a lot in America to be thankful for, because they kept that at the core of their theology. So I don't know if that responds to your question, but or I could talk about Octavia Butler, but no. Okay.
Three brilliant responses.
Thank you. Thank you. Would anybody else like to come in with a question? And sorry, Mark.
Great, thanks, John, and a huge thank you to all three of you for fabulous papers. So interesting in all sorts of ways. I've been thinking over the last few days a bit about the position and state of the humanities, and so this is a question really about the relationship between the apocalyptic and the humanities, and it's a question that any of you might like to comment on. But Matt, it was prompted by some of the things that you said, and so that idea you offered us of a kind of a vanishing resurrection that kind of forces us to kind of keep looking in new places. What are the implications of that model for how those of us in the humanities think about the humanities? So I guess I'm wary here about I don't want to align the position of the humanities with marginalized people all over the world. That seems kind of wrong in all sorts of ways. But I am interested in just kind of hearing you just kind of help me think through a little bit about that idea of kind of vanishing resurrection and what it might say to those of us who are in the humanities and trying to think about it.
I guess I should start. Boy, that's a great question. Like, I'd actually really be interested to hear what. I mean, it just sounds like you might have the beginning of an answer to that question. I don't know, because I'm interested in that. I mean, I can't really. Yeah, I mean, I think, I teach at the Divinity School, and I also teach at the, at the universities at large here. And so I think it's hard for me not to refract this question through religious studies in particular, especially at a large secular university like Harvard, where the study of religion is at the scale of the whole university is kind of marginalized and not, I think people find it relatively uninteresting for many folks, or think it's, something it's not. But this term, I taught a class that was called Apocalyptic Grief, and looked at just at like about half contemporary apocalyptic dystopian literatures, and the other half sort of looking at, this is an undergraduate class, like scriptural apocalyptic texts. And I mean, I had climate scientists, like PhD students in climate science and climate policy folks who were really like lining up to take this class. It was an undergraduate class, but a doctoral student who is just graduating their PhD in climate science and wanted to figure out some way to think about grief and apocalypse and how we imagine a new world and how we face the world that's coming. This isn't the question you asked. I think your question was more to do with how the humanities can embrace, how it might embrace this idea of vanishing returns or losing its own center for the sake of recentering itself. And I think that's I think I'd be really wary of to use a Christian like model to frame that methodologically would just be rewriting onto the project the centering of a Christian experience or a Christian reading. On the other hand, when I look at myself a little bit more deliberately within theology, as I want to think about myself as a theologian, and I kind of claim that part of myself, then I feel like I can, as a theologian, turn towards this methodology and use it as a problematic means of, turning towards those stories which have not been realized. For the humanities at large, now my answer is getting very rambly, but for the humanities at large, I think the question of a vanishing return or decentering a center would require some beginning center that we can move away from, and that seems already to be the problem, which is the idea of a center to the humanities that we can all agree upon or start from, that we can then tear down and then move outwards from. That, yeah. Sorry, so I just said a lot of nothing for 4 minutes. I'm curious what other folks would say about this, because it seems like a challenge and a problem, and I'm not sure that this model that I suggested works anywhere other than within a deliberately and self-consciously problematic Christian frame.
Rebecca, and then Mary. Rebecca first. Do you want to respond at all?
That is a very rich and I think challenging question. Perhaps what I'll offer for now, I want to sit with this more, is that I was also very struck by your reading of the resurrection there, Matthew, and the way you were talking about Christ's disappearance, which also then offers up new opportunities for us to think about how we stand, say, in relation to providence, the apocalypse, and so forth. I think if you also just even look at something that's become increasingly popular, and indeed, I come from more a religion and literature context, so when I even think about how literature just really emerged from a close relationship with theology, many of the developments of literary criticism drew from the reading of sacred texts, particularly in the West. That would be from the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, and I think within that you saw some really interesting methods of just and approaches to reading texts and thinking about people, and even the way in which Christ tells stories, and even the way his very story is revealed and also hidden within Scripture, I think can open up a lot of very interesting suggestive approaches to reading texts, and also showing us that the examined life is a difficult and challenging one. It requires us to constantly be, self-reflecting, even as we think about texts. And so perhaps, this mystery of, Christ's resurrection can help keep us in this mode that what we read and what we examine, there's always more to it. And so that can open up all kinds of creative ways of, even putting certain texts in conversation that haven't been before, and yet also agreeing that there are certain ways of reading that are profoundly generative. And one of them is, I think, to have a certain kind of giving up of the self over to a certain mystery in life, which I think, even for those who aren't theologians, even philosophers, like if I think of, many of the 19th century writers I think about, whether or not they espoused Christ as God, they certainly saw him as this fascinating philosopher. So I do actually think that there's a lot within the scriptural post-resurrection accounts that would be provide us with some really interesting literary approaches to literary criticism and thinking broadly about the humanities, and perhaps bringing in the Bible back a bit more into certain core humanities texts would be a really rich thing too, to re-enliven how we understand these biblical stories too, which have been huge shapers of culture, for better or for worse. So again, this is also starting to ramble as well, but I'd like to think about that more, because my instinct is that there is something very fruitful here and actually mutually donative between reading texts and then post-resurrection accounts. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Mary, would you like to respond?
I'm not sure, because I sadly missed most of Matthew's paper. I'm not really sure fully what the question is, because the terminology he's using. So maybe you could rephrase it again, or see, I don't know if I say something relevant to it.
I could, or Mark can.
Yeah, sure. So Matt's idea of a vanishing return was thinking about how, as in the resurrection sort of accounts, as Christ appears, he appears but then disappears again very quickly, and that disappearance requires us to look for him in new places, right? So it stops the consolidation of one way of thinking, of a centralized power, and pushes us to kind of keep looking in new places. So Matt was thinking about that in the context of Louise Eldridge's novel. So but I was just, wondering whether we might take something to that model and apply it in other ways.
Into the humanities, the study of the humanities. I mean, I don't know if this will relate at all. Again, my mind is so focused right now on African American tradition. I'm thinking about, but this is not really related to the resurrection of Christ so much. But I am thinking about the study of the humanities is so related to what does it mean to be human, and how in the kind of famous tension between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington wanted those who were formerly enslaved to just have like technical educations, just to learn how to do things with their hands, and part of that was, internalized white supremacy. Well, could they really do much more? Could they really study on this certain level? But then Du Bois, that's why I ran and pulled this in his essay of the Wings of Atalanta, where he talks about the danger of what he calls the deification of bread, of that what happens when all of our work is just about making rather than about thinking and analyzing, that leads to, according to him, a kind of obsession with mammon. And I mean, this is back in 1905 when he's writing, and it's certainly in America, we see with the humanities sadly kind of dying out, people losing jobs, a lot of focus taking off of it because of the focus on you have to do something and you have to have these jobs that will, make you money. But what's interesting though is the way Du Bois, he was talking about with the African American context, that this is a way to take away a kind of education that that leads you to examine, to look for what's not obvious, to search for something that's not obviously there, but to seek to have an examined life, he says, is to take away from your humanity. And he thought that in order for African Americans to truly be a part fully as humans in the American social imagination, that they needed to have access to this sort of education. So I don't know if this speaks to that at all, but I think it's interesting that he's writing in 1905 about the African American context, but it brings up a lot of the same questions that we have right now about the devaluing of the humanities. But again, if something is not obvious, there's a lot less patience to search for it and to really spend time and to have patience, which we know is what grows character. So I don't know if I just rambled myself, but it made me think of that just when you asked the question. So yeah.
Can I just say one more word about it?
Sure,
just
please.
think of the other two responses. I know we don't have much time, so I'll be quick, but there's a line of Rowan Williams, I can't remember where it's from, but he says this thing about, you could never imagine someone playing the Bach cello suite so well that you're like, oh, that's done. We never need to hear the Bach again, right? Mm-hmm. That there is something about, and maybe this is, a bunch of people in the humanities congratulating ourselves for being in the humanities, but there's something about humanities which is about raising the better question rather than about finding the final answer, right? Mm-hmm. Which is part of what I think Certeau is talking about when he says the mystic question is, where art thou? Not I have found Jesus, but where are you now? Like this idea of this search, I think, as methodologically foundational to what the study of the humanities is politically important and necessary, right? Like the refusal of any kind of final answer is an important political project and part of what I think education of the humanities can cultivate in folks. So how the humanities says that's what we're about, or communicates to folks that this is a necessary skill, a necessary approach, is a question I don't have an answer to, but I think it's fundamental to what the study of the humanities is about.
I'm aware we've hit the 45 mark, so I'm just going to invite Mary and Rebecca, if echoing Matthew, either of you would like to give us a final sentence, 2, 3, whatever, anything that's finally come to you would like to end us, with which us to end. Now's your moment. So Rebecca first, then Mary, and then we will finish.
Well, there's a lot I'd love to talk about. Perhaps if I could just jump off of what Matthew was saying just now, because this whole question of humanities and education is very important, and I think does touch on a lot of the themes not only dear to Eagleton, but also even just implicitly in this essay. I think also what's needed in order for a recovery of the humanities is also, or an enriched understanding of the humanities suitable to the times in which we are living, is also a recovery or a deeper understanding of what education itself is all about too, because you do see this increasingly. I notice in a lot of universities, it's education is understood as being some kind of tool or largely practical thing. And while that is important and we have to think about careers and transferable skills, hopefully what we're also doing is teaching people how to become conscientious readers of themselves and the world around them. And so actually then the enterprise of education is to help build, with all the caveats we have to include, the kind of, New Jerusalem, or to be able to even just see it in our midst the way other people are, deserving of our dignity, and, the deeper, richer understanding and view of the world that we can have through a holistic education, I think could help really speak to many of the aspirations we see in Eagleton's essay that we were looking at. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Mary, last word if you'd like it.
Yes, I just want to hit on Eagleton's emphasis of the urgency that we're seeing now, and the urgency that I kind of picked up that I think, again, has been there a long time, and particularly the African American community, the urgency for change, the urgency for really seeing the humanity of one another. And I feel like in our current even world socio-political climate, with divisions and rise of fascism, and so much has to do with an inability to really read one another, read the situation, and there's an urgency to be able to learn to see and to see injustices, and to see the wrong that needs to be right, and to even want to, back to what Rebecca said, to want to ask those questions rather than just being settled and just being okay. I feel like we should be constantly in a state of discomfort. If we're comfortable, there's something wrong. And I think, the study of the humanities is always going to look more closely at what's wrong. That doesn't sound very hopeful, but what have we gotten off here? I mean, it is hard when there's no common core to it, but even just collectively as human beings and respecting the humanity of one another, I just really think when Eagleton's talking about that sense of crying out with a sense of urgency for mercy, and looking for mercy, again, we have to have eyes to see those needs, both in ourselves and in others. So maybe that would be my final thing.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for all those who joined us to say, well, this will be up on Lancaster Words YouTube channel within a week or two. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Wonderful papers, wonderful discussion, and yeah, obviously profoundly important. Thank you very much. Shalom.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.